All right, so this is a video where we start getting into the justifications for capital punishment. So these are arguments in favor of the death penalty, okay? You have some really good readings on your As You Learn page from some of the leading scholars who've ever written about this. So particularly if you're a death penalty supporter, you should read these, but it's important to read them just to understand them as well. If you want to know how death penalty supporters talk, read those articles. If you want to know what they focus on, read those articles, please. It will help you understand them. On your As You Learn page, you have a PowerPoint slideshow about retribution, and then you have another one about deterrence and incapacitation. Okay, so this video deals with retribution, so you can open that PowerPoint slideshow as you listen to this video, or you can listen to the video and then see the slideshow another time. Because obviously I'm not going through it, slide by slide in terms of every piece of information. Let's talk first what the definition of retribution means. Some people think retribution is an emotional response aimed at getting even with the offender, but that's actually vengeance. So when someone hurts you, so say let's say someone's cheated on you or broken up with you, you want to get even with them. That's vengeance. If someone, God forbid, murders your child, obviously you're going to want to get even with them. That's vengeance. Okay. Retribution is a rational response of the government. It's not emotional at all. It means righting a wrong. So think of the scales of justice, the famous scales of justice. If you don't know what they are, just Google it. Okay. When an offender breaks the rules, like murder, they've gained an unfair advantage. The death penalty rewrites the scales of justice. So, for example, a person takes a life, then the offender sacrifices their life. That's rational. Okay, so it is a rational response of the government to punish someone who commits a crime. Now, whether the death penalty is needed for retribution is another issue. Whether we actually have to kill people to achieve retribution is another issue. But I want you to know it's a rational response of the government. It's not irrational or emotional, okay? Retribution is public, but vengeance is private. So retribution is something done by the state. Retribution is justified by law. Vengeance is not allowed. You're not allowed to seek vengeance. If you do, you'll be punished. Another difference between the two is, the death vengeance is an emotional response. It's natural, but the death penalty is about socialization. So you could argue that the death penalty is important because it helps us learn the rules of society. So killing is wrong, and we believe it so strongly we're willing to kill you. That might be contradictory, but we'll see. All right, some key points. Historically, retribution has been the highest reason cited in public opinion polls as to why people favor the death penalty. So when you say, do you support the death penalty or not? When people say yes, they're asked why. The number one reason are things related to retribution. So like to get even with them, they deserve it, a life for a life, an eye for an eye. Those are all statements that are consistent with retribution. And you can look up death penalty polls and find out this information. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, let's remember some key facts. Okay. Only about 1% of street killers actually get the death penalty, right? Nationwide. Only about 1%. And as we've seen before, less than 1% actually get executed ultimately, right? Literally no white collar and corporate offenders get the death penalty, including people who kill others. So we can conclude pretty clearly that we fail to provide retribution by using the death penalty because we just don't use it enough. Now, some of you might say, well, some justice is better than none. Okay, that's a good argument. But the question is, do we need the death penalty when it's used so rarely, or could we get more justice by using something like life imprisonment without parole? If we just went ahead and sentenced everyone to that, maybe we'd actually get more justice ultimately. These are the debates, okay? All right. Sorry, I'm looking through the slides here in terms of what's really important. Here's what death penalty supporters say, okay? And you'll see this in the articles that you're supposed to read for this week. There's no doubt that murderers deserve to die. That's what they argue. They've earned it. This is the rational part. Murder is the ultimate crime. the ultimate crime calls for the ultimate punishment, and the ultimate punishment in states where it's legal is the death penalty. So if you commit a murder in a death penalty state, you have earned the death penalty. This is perfectly logical. And we said the death penalty is currently the ultimate punishment in 30 jurisdictions in America. So that's 28 states plus the federal government and the military. Now, they almost never use it. We talked about that. But that's why it's rational, because the punishment potential is known, it's published. And so if you commit a murder in one of those states or jurisdictions, that's what you can get, right? Now, here's the key question I want you to think about, not just for the class, but going forward. Assuming that murderers merit death, assuming that murderers deserve to die, does that mean the government has the responsibility to carry it out? Or is it just their right? Certainly the government has the right to do it, but should they be required to do it? Are they morally responsible to do it? That's the debatable part, right? You could argue that the murderers deserve the death penalty, but the state should not carry it out, because when the second part of this week, we're going to look at problems with the death penalty. When you see significant racial bias and a threat to the innocent and enormous financial costs and things like that, then you might say, wait a minute, it's not a rational policy. They deserve it, but we shouldn't do it because there's significant costs. We'll see that later as we move on. Now, the last part of this slideshow deals with what the experts say. So this is a survey that I did of death penalty experts and from around the country. And you'll see the sample size is about in the 40s for most of the questions. So that's the number of experts that we're talking about. But these are people who teach and do research about the death penalty for a living. And so they answered these questions. What you're going to see in the slideshow is not only the percentage of people that answered questions in a certain way, but you're also going to see their actual words in terms of what they said when I said why. So for example, the first question is, does capital punishment as actually practiced in the United States achieve retribution? That is, provide justice for murder victims, their families, and society at large. So then they say yes, no, or unsure. Okay. Then I asked them, why do you say that? So there's a lot of explanation for it. What you see there in that slide, this is slide number 10 in the PowerPoint slideshow, 31% of the experts say we achieve retribution. Okay. That's not a very high number, right? 31%. Now there's a star by that, because when you go through the answers and you see what they say, the people that said yes said things like, it might, or it does, but it's a very small source of retribution because we don't use it enough, as you might expect. So go through these and you'll see first the people who said that the death penalty does not achieve retribution. They said it's used far too infrequently. Far too infrequently. 2 people in a row. Okay. There's no social science evidence to suggest it has any therapeutic value for anybody. No amount of punishment will redeem the value of the dead victim. You can't bring them back. Many families still feel sorrow and have no sense of closure. Same kind of idea. There's research on that. There's a very long answer. Families of murder victims who do feel that the execution of the perpetrator provided justice for them, others feel the precise opposite. Many think it will bring closure, but it usually does not. Another expert said, it throws away a human life. It makes killers of every citizen of the polity. Man, woman, and child. Makes us all killers. Now, those people who said yes said things like this. In some cases it does, or sporadically so it does. It does in some cases. One expert said of all the issues, the only issue supported by empirical evidence is that the death penalty achieves retribution. That's an interesting statement. And then one expert said it's an emotional response to murder, which is not. Remember, we talked about that. It's a rational response. Keep going on through the yeses. People said yes, but the delay in execution, remember now we're talking about 20 years on death row on average. That delay may serve to lessen the retributive effect. And another said to a limited extent. Okay. Keep going on reading through them. We know many victims' families are not satisfied with capital punishment, while others are satisfied by a life sentence. These are the ones who said it does provide retribution. Okay. And then you can go through all the people that said they were unsure and the reasons why. Very interesting stuff here. these are just people that really don't know for sure. Okay, and they kind of stating their reasons. Now, the next thing in the slideshow is a brief statement about retribution in religion. And if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to look it up for yourself. Depending upon the religion, some of the world's religions endorse the death penalty, support it, and some of them don't. Obviously, in a country like the United States, where you have a large number of Christians that are still Christians today, the Bible is very prevalent, right? And in the South, you're talking about things like Southern baptism. If you read the Bible, there's actually no clear answer as to whether capital punishment is a good idea according to God. If you're Catholic, the closest person to God is the Pope, and the Pope says the death penalty is against the death penalty. Okay? But a criminologist by the name of Scott Johnson actually analyzed, he's a Christian, by the way, he actually analyzed 5 versions of the Bible looking for pro-death penalty statements in favor of the death penalty, statements against the death penalty, and also what happened to murderers in the Bible, what actually happened to them. This is what he concluded in looking for that. Number 1, there's no clear biblical mandate for the death penalty. Okay. Number 2, all sides can find support for their arguments. He also finds, number 3, more support for the death penalty in the Old Testament. But 4, the New Testament doesn't refute it explicitly, but it's obviously less supportive of it. And then, maybe most importantly, the 5th major finding is that of the people that were known to be murderers and we knew what happened to them, only 4 of the 22 were executed. So I think that's 18%, if I remember correctly. Check them out. So even in biblical times, when murderers were identified, they were not generally being executed. What was happening is they were being sent away. They were being expelled to live in towns for murder. Okay. Now, I'll leave you with the story of Jesus from the Bible, from the book of John. Okay. If you're not religious, this is irrelevant. I understand that, but it's interesting. Now, early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. And I'm not going to try to pronounce, the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. This is a death penalty offense, right? When they sat in her midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. What do you say?" So the Old Testament calls for this adulterer to be killed, executed. What do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, quote, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even until the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing alone in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So, if you're a Christian, this is the Son of God, given the opportunity to sentence someone to death for a crime that's clearly a capital crime in the Old Testament. And he says, no. And he tells her to go and sin no more. Now, we're not going to let murderers out and say, go and murder no more, right? But this is a pretty clear evidence of what maybe Christianity might say about the death penalty if they follow the actual teachings of Jesus. Okay. All right. There's some ironies there about religion, but let's wrap this up, okay? Retribution is the first major justification for the death penalty. And if you feel that people who commit murder deserve to be executed, that's fine. It makes perfect sense. I know that if one of my children were tortured, raped, murdered, of course I would want the person to suffer. It's natural. But the death penalty is a state policy. It's a policy of government. And policies of government are supposed to be rational. They're supposed to, number one, meet their goals, and supposed to, number two, provide benefits that outweigh the costs. And so this is how we evaluate policies in the United States. As you'll see in this class, the death penalty is so rare that it doesn't achieve its intended goals. So like retribution, we're talking about 0.18% of people committing murder have actually been executed. That doesn't sound very successful, right? And then you'll see some of the costs. So very modest benefits, and then we'll see some of the costs and have to weigh them. And you'll see that generally people think the costs outweigh the benefits. Now, there's still the issue of deterrence and incapacitation, and so we'll get into that in the next video. Okay, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can email me or and then request a Zoom session or whatever you want to do. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. All right, read on and read the PowerPoints too.